Before we dive in, if you're into true crime and love unraveling mysteries like this one, consider subscribing. We cover some of the most chilling cases, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. It started as a routine traffic stop, but what officers uncovered would haunt them forever. The man in custody had been living under a stolen identity for decades, and behind his carefully constructed mask was a serial killer who had evaded justice for years. To understand the chilling truth behind this case, we have to go back to 1985. For years, people knew him as Peter Sullivan, a reserved but friendly man who worked as a mechanic in Des Moines, Iowa. He attended community events, helped his neighbors fix their cars, and never raised suspicion. But Peter Sullivan never existed. He was a ghost, a fabricated persona crafted by a man whose real name would send shivers down the nation's spine: Richard Alistair Hayes. Hayes had assumed the identity of a deceased child, stolen their birth certificate, and used it to craft a new life. But why? Because behind his unassuming demeanor lay a violent history, one of abduction, deception, and murder. What made Hayes so dangerous was his ability to disappear, not just physically but legally. He carefully studied missing persons reports, searching for identities that could be exploited. By the time he moved to Iowa, he had already lived under at least 3 different names in various states, each one allowing him to escape his past crimes. Authorities now believe that his killing spree may have begun as early as 1978. Neighbors recalled that Peter Sullivan seemed almost too normal. He was polite but distant, always keeping conversations short. One former coworker later admitted that something about him felt off, but nothing concrete enough to raise an alarm. The unsettling truth was that Hayes thrived in the art of deception, using his carefully curated normalcy as the perfect camouflage. But even the most carefully constructed lies have cracks. In 1992, a woman named Linda Reeves came forward with a disturbing encounter. She had been on a date with a man she met through a newspaper personals ad, a man who introduced himself as Peter Sullivan. During dinner, she noticed how intently he watched her, how every movement seemed studied. When he offered to drive her home, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. She declined, and days later, the same man was reported to have approached another woman, one who was never seen again. Hayes had mastered the art of slipping through the cracks. He moved from state to state, never staying too long in one place. By the time authorities connected his name to disappearances, he was already gone. But despite his careful planning, his past was beginning to catch up with him. To understand the chilling truth behind this case, we have to go back to 1985. The identity of a deceased child, stolen their birth certificate, and used it to craft a new life. But why? Because behind his unassuming demeanor lay a violent history, one of abduction, deception, and murder. It started with a series of disappearances. Women who seemingly vanished without a trace. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, just gone. Samantha Caldwell was the first confirmed victim. A promising law student, she was last seen leaving a cafe late at night. Witnesses reported she got into a car with a man they described as charming, well-spoken, and trustworthy. That man was Hayes. Her body was discovered 6 months later in a shallow grave, her remains barely recognizable. But there was something even more disturbing. The method matched an unsolved case from 1987. Investigators began to connect the dots. Each case had the same pattern. Young women, all lured by a man who seemed completely ordinary. And each time, he left no evidence behind. But Samantha's case wasn't an isolated event. Over the next 2 years, more women disappeared under eerily similar circumstances. Angela Marsh, a 24-year-old waitress, vanished after leaving her late-night shift. Her friends recalled that she mentioned a kind customer who always tipped generously, one she had agreed to meet after work. She was never seen again. When her remains were found in a wooded area miles away, investigators noticed something chilling. The positioning of her body, the ligature marks on her wrists, and the surgical precision with which certain post-mortem injuries had been inflicted all pointed to a singular predator, Hayes. In 1995, a security camera captured a brief but crucial piece of evidence. A woman named Laura Brinkley was seen walking through a dimly lit parking lot, her pace quickening as she glanced nervously over her shoulder. Moments later, a dark-colored sedan pulled up beside her. She hesitated, stepping back. Then, as if recognizing the driver, she leaned in. The footage cut off before anything further could be seen, but Laura never made it home that night. Her disappearance baffled authorities. With no clear suspect and no body, it seemed like another dead-end case. It wasn't until forensic teams cross-referenced the fibers found in Samantha Caldwell's clothing with trace evidence discovered in Hayes's vehicle years later that the connection became undeniable. Despite his careful planning, Hayes made one mistake that would ultimately unravel his carefully maintained facade. In early 1996, he targeted a woman named Rachel Dawson. Unlike his previous victims, Rachel was able to fight back. When she was reported missing, her apartment showed signs of a violent struggle: overturned furniture, deep scratches on the wooden floor, and, most importantly, a single drop of blood on the doorframe. DNA testing was still in its infancy, but it was enough to plant the first seeds of doubt about Peter Sullivan's true identity. Rachel's disappearance sent a ripple effect through the investigation. The public grew wary, and witnesses began coming forward with stories of Peter Sullivan behaving strangely, of women who had expressed unease about him but had brushed it off as paranoia. Hayes, sensing the walls closing in, vanished again, but this time authorities were finally one step ahead. It started with a series of disappearances. Women who seemingly vanished without a trace. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, just gone. If you're finding this case as gripping as we are, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories. For decades, law enforcement had no leads. Hayes was meticulous. He changed locations, used fake identities, and blended seamlessly into society. But his downfall came with a simple mistake: a broken taillight. The routine stop took an unexpected turn when the officer ran the license plate. The name didn't match the car's registration. Hayes tried to bluff his way out, but when the officer asked him to step out, he bolted. Inside his car, officers found a trove of horrors: fake IDs, chloroform, and a list of names. Some of them were already dead. Others were still missing. The FBI confirmed what local police had suspected. Hayes had been living under false identities, committing crimes across multiple states, slipping through the cracks each time. In 2024, after years of evading justice, Richard Alistair Hayes was sentenced to life without parole. The families of his victims sat in the courtroom, some finding solace, others still haunted by the horrors he inflicted. In the end, Hayes' obsession with hiding in plain sight became his undoing. But the scars he left behind will never truly heal. At the end of the day, cases like this remind us just how much can hide behind an ordinary face. If you want more true crime stories that make you think twice, be sure to subscribe. We have plenty more to uncover together. We often think of serial killers as monsters lurking in the shadows, but the most terrifying ones walk among us, unnoticed, their crimes masked by ordinary lives. Richard Hayes lived as someone else for decades, deceiving an entire community. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who blend in best. How well do you really know those around you?